Earlier in this webinar series, Carol Palp presented the illustrious network around Anna Maria von Schurman in the 17th century. And this network was indeed famous, and I learned about it first from Pieta van Beek, who's here today as well, I think, in the 1990s when I was starting working with learned women. The women in this network around von Schurman were in touch either via correspondence or they met in person or both. So this was a contemporary network. And here I will make a small distinction between this and the wider, much wider notion of the Republic of Letters that is not confined to time and space. The circumstances were very different for different learned women, and that affected, of course, their networking when it comes to strategies and concerning with whom they were in touch and how extensive the network were. In this paper, I will focus such factors, really pragmatics of life for some women I will bring up. It's hard to generalize, but there might be similar patterns. So were there contemporary female networks or societies that we do not already know of? And that's also very, very hard to know, especially since still letters and archives are hard to find and in many cases have never been searched out. One example of this when it comes to learned women is the famous Queen Christina of Sweden. To my knowledge, her correspondence still has not been fully investigated. Only some selected letters have been published and so on. So the same year I started to work with a Swedish poetess, the one who corresponded with Otto Sperling in Copenhagen. She's to the right in this slide, Sophia Elizabethbrenner. A novel was published with the title The 10th Muse. And in this novel, the Swedish novel, a scholar went searching for Sophia Elizabethbrenner's archives and correspondence. And the author of this novel was quite well researched, so I found myself in the hunt in the same European cities as the scholar in search for these letters. And eventually, in the novel, the scholar found evidence that Sophia Elizabethbrenner was part of a very secret and early all-European women's cause union. So the question is, did I find similar evidence in real life? Sadly, no. And the reasons for why not will be in focus here as well. So I wanted to just point to some of the basic factors of life, the factors that mattered for those people in early modern times, when it comes also to the distinction between men and women. Social class did not matter that much, while economic circumstances, of course, mattered for both women and men. And when you compare women in between themselves, you have a difference in the level of erudition they managed to acquire, of course. Some acquired classical languages and other languages, others not. And above all, of course, the marital status was also important. Did they marry? Did they have a lot of children? And so on. Those factors were not so relevant for men, but they were certainly relevant for women when it comes to how they would network, I believe. And this is an image of this illustrious network around Anna Maria von Schurman. And incidentally, Queen Christina of Sweden, you see here to the right, she was also visiting von Schurman and was sort of part in this network. And to the left, you can see Batjomakin. I will just start by mentioning Batjomakin and von Schurman, comparing such factors, and then move on to a couple of other women. So here I list these basic factors that you saw before, and also to what extent the women acted as professional writers and how the patronage appeared, whether they were patrons themselves of other women or men, or if they enjoyed patronage from other men. And finally then the network, did they network with other women per se, specifically? Anna Maria von Schurman and Baccio Makin both acted very much as patrons of other women. Baccio Makin started this school for gentlewomen and so on. And they also had patrons. Anna Maria von Schurman was helped much by André Verivier, with whom she also corresponded. And this correspondence was published and very famous, and I will get back to that as well. I wouldn't say that they acted as professional writers in that, as far as I know, they did not get paid for what they wrote, their poems and so on. And the financial situation for both, I think, was not, at times it was hard, but not throughout. And there was, of course, a difference that Baccio Makin was married and had a lot of children, while Anna Maria von Schurman remained unmarried throughout her lives. And both were highly, highly educated, of course. And then I wanted just to bring up a few women from different generations. First, we have Elisabet Jane Weston, who was British and lived in Prague most of her life. She lived a generation earlier than did von Schurman and her circle. While two Scandinavian women here, Dorothy Engelsbetsdatter and Sophia Elizabethbrenner, lived a generation later. And they had, in a way, similar circumstances in that they acted as professional writers, at least to some extent, I believe. Elisabet Jane Weston, she had a great education, and she was famous already very early. She had a patron, Georg Martinus von Waldhoven, who constantly supported her throughout her life. And her poetry was published through his help, and it was quite famous. And she and he corresponded in Latin, and this correspondence was also published and became famous. Even so, her family was impoverished when she was only 15 years old. And she constantly worked, sending petitions, letters, and so on, in order to help her family and to help in the support herself and her family. She expresses her gratitude for poems that she received payment for several times, and so on. In a similar way, Dorothy Engelsbetsdatter was a Norwegian and lived also in Denmark and Copenhagen a few years. She didn't have a systematic education in Latin, and she was a writer of psalms and a prolific writer of psalms. Oh, sorry. This collections of the psalms were also published during her lifetime, and she got paid for them. And it was quite important that she was the widow of a clergyman and also had to support herself. These women, all three had large families, many children, and they had an insecure financial situation. Sophia Elizabethbrenner, finally, she also had a good erudition to begin with and married a husband who supported her learning. And she was early on also famous for her occasional poetry. And she was also supported by other men. They all had patrons supporting them, helping in publishing poetry, so that they all had collections published during their lifetime. Still, I did not find evidence that either of these three women were networking with other women per se. They were not part of such a female network, contemporary network, as the network, like the network around Franz Schulman. This is an example of the type of network that Sophia Brender had. She corresponded with many learned men, above all, in Latin. And she did so in many ways to market herself and to also get help in funding the collection of her poetry. And she was helped in this work by the close network of illustrious men in Sweden who helped out in this process. She did correspond with some women as well. You can see here there are three women in the list here. The first of which held a public speech in Latin in Sweden and was very much praised for this. And Sophia Brenner immediately sent a laudatory poem and so on. The learned men around Sophia Brenner saw to it that she was early mentioned in Giornale dei Letterati, for example, and they spread the word so that she would get response from illustrious men all over Europe. And here is an example of how a network chain could look like when it comes to Sophia Brenner. She would send a laudatory poem, in this case to Thomas Kingo, who was a songwriter in Denmark, along with a letter in Latin and some samples of her poetry. And in this case, I don't think he ever responded to her in the way she expected and hoped for, via a laudatory poem in return that would be published together with the collected poetry. But he forwarded this material, the entire package, and had it copied to other men, who in turn also forwarded it to other men. In this way, she got in touch with Otto Sperling, the younger, who's already been mentioned here, the Danish professor in Copenhagen, who collected information about learned women in all over the world, and above all in Scandinavia. I think his list contains 1,399 women or something like that. It was indeed an ambitious project and a very popular genre at the time. And he asked Sophia Brenner for more information about other women, and she was eager to support with any information she could. And they continued to correspond for 12 years and in Latin. And he also forwarded the information so that she got a dedication of a dissertation by Sebastian Courtauld in Kiel and so on. So she got response in many ways by just sending this first to Thomas Kingo, who actually never answered her specifically. And Sophia Brenner and Sperling, they corresponded. And in this correspondence, we find a lot of echoes of the famous earlier correspondences published between Franz Schulman and André Rieu on one hand, and Weston and Elisabet Jane Weston and her patron, von Waldhoven, as well. They imitate the correspondences, but they never specifically mention either of these women, only copy phrases and so on very clearly and elegantly throughout the correspondence. So Sophia Brenner acted very much as a professional author. She expected to get paid for poetry, as did also the songwriter Dorrit Engelsbredsdatter in Denmark. And Elisabet Jane Weston was also, to some extent, a professional author, I would say. And even though they were not networking in the way that I think that they systematically met other learned women or corresponded with them to a larger extent, They were all eager to encourage publicly and officially as much as they could other learned women. Sofia Brenner took any opportunity to argue the women's right to study in many of her occasional poems, for example, that was published. And Dorothy Engelsbredsdotter similarly welcomed her fellow poetesses into their shared profession, and so on. And one example of the status that such a poet like the Swedish Sophia Brender held was a correspondence that I found between Russian diplomats. She got a request from the Russian court to write a poem in memory of Tsar Peter the Great in 1725. And also the contents of the desired poem was added to this request. And but she refused, frankly. She would not do this. And the reason was not political. The reason was that she had not been paid for a previous poem she sent the year before on the coronation of Catherine I. And the Russian diplomats reported about this, and Tsarina quickly decided that payment should be made, and a coronation medal in gold would have to be sent to the Swedish poetess right away. And this was reported back to the Swedish poetess, and then she announced now she was willing to write this poem. Unfortunately, I did not find the original poems, either of them, in St. Petersburg. I believe at some point these archives have been transferred to Warsaw. But anyway, it's an example of how I don't think they negotiated any authority, really, these women. They really had or held this status. And you can see then, even though they did not network in person much, they also wrote themselves into this discourse of learned women across time within the main Republic of Letters that included both women and men. That is how I see them as part of the main Republic of Letters, at least a woman like Sophia Brenner, even though she was not part of a female network like Anna Maria von Schurman and her contemporaries were. So with that, I thank you for your attention.